Marcus Wellington stood in the marble foyer of his Beverly Hills mansion, his usually perfect appearance disheveled after another sleepless night. The sound that had haunted his family for 3 weeks echoed through the grand hallways once again, the inconsolable crying of his newborn son, James. Despite his vast fortune and access to the world's best medical care, Marcus felt completely powerless. The crying had started immediately after James came home from the hospital. Day and night, the infant wailed with such intensity that it seemed impossible for such a small body to produce such powerful sounds. Marcus had hired the most expensive pediatricians, brought in specialists from around the globe, and even consulted with alternative medicine practitioners. Nothing worked. The baby would quiet only for brief moments before resuming his desperate cries. Dr. Harrison Mitchell, one of California's most renowned pediatricians, emerged from the nursery on the second floor, his face showing the same frustration that had marked every medical professional who had tried to help. He descended the curved staircase slowly, his leather medical bag in hand, looking defeated. "Mr. Wellington," Dr. Mitchell said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I've conducted every test imaginable. James appears to be perfectly healthy. His lungs are strong, his reflexes are normal, and there are no signs of colic, reflux, or any other common conditions that cause excessive crying in infants." Marcus ran his hand through his usually perfectly styled hair. At 45, he had built a technology empire worth billions, but all his success meant nothing when he couldn't help his own child. His wife, Catherine, had been admitted to a private psychiatric facility the previous week after suffering a complete nervous breakdown from the stress and sleep deprivation. "There has to be something," Marcus insisted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Babies don't cry like this for no reason." The sound. He paused, struggling to describe the heart-wrenching quality of his son's cries. "It's not normal crying, doctor. It sounds like he's in agony." Dr. Mitchell nodded sympathetically. He had treated thousands of children throughout his career, but James Wellington's case was unlike anything he had encountered. The crying had a quality that seemed to penetrate straight through to one's soul, filled with such apparent suffering that it affected everyone who heard it. "I understand your frustration," the doctor said gently. "In my 30 years of practice, I've never encountered anything quite like this. The intensity and duration are extraordinary. We've ruled out all physical causes, infection, injury, developmental issues, neurological problems. The blood work is perfect. The imaging studies show normal development." The mansion, which usually hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-run household, had become a place of tension and despair. The household staff moved through their duties with strained expressions, many requesting transfers to the Wellington family's other properties. The few who remained wore earplugs and worked quickly, eager to escape the constant sound of the baby's distress. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the head housekeeper who had managed the Wellington household for 15 years, approached the two men with obvious reluctance. Her usual composure was cracked, dark circles under her eyes testament to the stress that had settled over everyone in the house. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her British accent more pronounced than usual when she was nervous, "I'm afraid we've lost another nurse. Miss Rodriguez gave her notice this morning. That makes 7 nannies in 3 weeks, sir." Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had hired the most qualified childcare professionals money could buy, registered nurses with decades of experience, nannies who had worked with royal families, infant specialists with advanced degrees. All of them had left, unable to cope with the relentless crying and their inability to provide comfort. Dr. Mitchell observed the interaction with growing concern. He had treated many wealthy families, but the Wellington case was extraordinary not just because of the medical mystery, but because of how it was destroying everyone involved. The stress was taking a visible toll on Marcus, who had always been known for his calm, analytical approach to problems. "Mr. Wellington," the doctor said carefully, "have you considered the possibility that James might be experiencing some form of emotional distress? Sometimes infants can be remarkably sensitive to environmental stress or family dynamics." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting this is somehow our fault? That we're causing our son's suffering?" "Not at all," Dr. Mitchell replied quickly. "But infants are incredibly perceptive. They can sense tension, anxiety, and emotional turmoil in ways we don't fully understand. The stress in this household has become quite intense. Perhaps if James were in a different environment temporarily. Absolutely not, Marcus said firmly. My son stays here, in his home, with his family. There has to be a medical solution. What about the specialist from Johns Hopkins you mentioned? Dr. Mitchell sighed. Dr. Sarah Chun from Johns Hopkins had already reviewed James's case files remotely and had no additional suggestions. The medical community was baffled. Blood tests showed no abnormalities. Genetic screening revealed no inherited conditions, and neurological assessments indicated normal brain function. The crying from upstairs intensified suddenly, and all three adults winced. The sound seemed to echo through the house's high ceilings, bouncing off the expensive artwork and imported marble surfaces. It was a sound that had become so constant that its brief absences felt unnatural. Marcus's phone buzzed constantly with messages from his business partners and board members. His technology company was in the middle of crucial negotiations for a merger that could increase his wealth by another $1 billion. But he hadn't been able to focus on work for weeks. His assistant had been forced to reschedule meetings repeatedly as Marcus refused to leave his son. The baby's room has been checked for environmental factors, Dr. Mitchell continued, consulting his notes. No mold, no unusual chemicals, optimal temperature, and humidity. The crib meets all safety standards. The mattress is organic, and we've even tested for electromagnetic fields from the household electronics. They had tried everything modern medicine could offer. Specialists in infant neurology, gastroenterology, and psychiatry had all examined James. Alternative practitioners had been consulted, specialists in infant massage, aromatherapy, and even a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine who claimed to understand infant energy imbalances. Mrs. Whitman cleared her throat delicately. Sir, if I may, there is one matter we need to discuss. The temporary staff from the agency are becoming increasingly difficult to retain. Word has spread among the domestic service community about the challenges here. The agency is finding it difficult to place qualified individuals. This was a diplomatic way of saying that the Wellington household had developed a reputation as an impossible assignment. Domestic workers talked among themselves, and news of the crying baby that no one could calm had spread throughout Beverly Hills and beyond. Marcus felt the weight of failure pressing down on him. He was a man accustomed to solving problems through intelligence, resources, and determination. He had built his fortune by identifying challenges that others couldn't solve and creating innovative solutions. But this tiny infant had defeated him completely. Dr. Mitchell packed his equipment slowly, clearly reluctant to abandon the case, but having no more options to offer. I'll continue researching similar cases in medical literature, he said. Sometimes rare conditions are documented in obscure journals, and I'll reach out to colleagues internationally. The doctor's departure left Marcus alone with Mrs. Whitman in the foyer. The crying continued from upstairs, seeming to grow louder in the evening silence. The sun was setting through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the expensive furnishings that suddenly felt meaningless. Sir, Mrs. Whitman said hesitantly, perhaps we should consider expanding our search for help. Not just medical professionals, but other types of caregivers. Sometimes experience matters more than credentials. Sarah Thompson checked the address on the paper in her hand one more time as she stood before the imposing gates of the Wellington estate. At 58 years old, she had worked as a domestic helper for over 30 years, but she had never been called to a house quite this grand. The wrought iron gates, the manicured gardens visible beyond them, and the massive Mediterranean-style mansion in the distance spoke of wealth beyond anything she had experienced. The employment agency had been desperate when they called her the previous evening. Mrs. Rodriguez at Elite Domestic Services had sounded frazzled as she explained the situation. A wealthy family needed immediate help with housekeeping and some childcare duties. The pay was exceptional, but the assignment came with unusual challenges that had caused other workers to leave quickly. Sarah had listened carefully as Mrs. Rodriguez explained about the crying baby that no one could calm. Other workers had described it as unbearable, but Sarah had raised 4 children of her own and helped care for dozens of others throughout her career. She had dealt with colicky babies, sick children, and difficult situations that had tested her patience and skills. Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Rodriguez had said, "I know this isn't your usual type of assignment, but, frankly, you're one of the most experienced caregivers on our roster. If anyone can handle this situation, it might be you." Sarah had accepted the position immediately. After losing her husband Robert to cancer 2 years earlier, she had thrown herself into work as a way to cope with grief. The extra income would also help her daughter Monica, who was struggling to pay for nursing school while raising her own young son. As she walked up the long driveway, Sarah noticed the unusual quiet around the property. Most wealthy homes she had worked in bustled with activity: gardeners, maintenance workers, delivery people. But the Wellington estate felt almost abandoned despite its obvious expense and careful upkeep. Mrs. Whitman greeted Sarah at the front door, and the strain on the older woman's face was immediately apparent. The head housekeeper's usually perfect appearance was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights. "Mrs. Thompson, thank goodness you're here," Mrs. Whitman said, her British accent crisp despite her obvious fatigue. "I do hope Mrs. Rodriguez explained the unique challenges of this position." Before Sarah could respond, the sound that had driven away 7 previous caregivers filled the air. The crying was indeed unlike anything she had heard before. It wasn't the typical wails of a hungry or uncomfortable baby, nor the rhythmic crying of colic. This sound carried a depth of distress that seemed to penetrate straight to her heart. "How long has he been crying like this?" Sarah asked, setting down her modest bag in the marble foyer. 3 weeks, Mrs. Whitman replied. "Constantly. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with him, but—" She gestured helplessly toward the sound coming from upstairs. Sarah listened intently to the quality of the crying as Mrs. Whitman led her through the house. Her experienced ear picked up nuances that others might miss. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm that suggested the baby was trying to communicate something specific rather than simply expressing general distress. The mansion was stunning, but Sarah noticed how the luxury felt cold and unwelcoming. The high ceilings and marble surfaces created an echo that would amplify every sound. The expensive furniture was beautiful, but not particularly comfortable. Everything was perfect, but somehow lacking in warmth. "Mr. Wellington is in his study," Mrs. Whitman explained as they climbed the curved staircase. "He hasn't slept properly in weeks. His wife is receiving medical care at a private facility. The stress has been overwhelming for the entire family." Sarah nodded sympathetically. She had worked with many families during crisis periods and understood how quickly stress could spiral out of control when parents felt helpless to comfort their child. As they reached the 2nd floor, the crying became louder and more intense. Mrs. Whitman paused outside an elaborate doorway decorated with hand-painted designs of animals and fairy tale characters. "This is James's nursery," she said. "I should warn you, Mrs. Thompson, that many very qualified professionals have tried to help. Pediatric nurses, nannies with decades of experience, even specialists in infant care. None of them could provide any relief." Sarah smiled gently. "Sometimes it's not about qualifications. Sometimes it's about understanding." When they entered the nursery, Sarah was struck first by its overwhelming luxury. The room was enormous, decorated with custom furniture and expensive artwork. But despite all the money spent, it felt more like a showroom than a place where a baby would feel secure and loved. In the center of the room stood an ornate crib where tiny James Wellington lay crying. Sarah approached slowly, taking in every detail of the scene. The baby was small for 3 weeks old, his face red from crying, his tiny fists clenched in frustration. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They seemed to be searching for something, looking desperately for some form of connection or understanding. "Hello, little one," Sarah said softly, her voice cutting through the crying in a way that was somehow different from the clinical tones of the medical professionals who had tried to help. She didn't immediately reach for the baby, instead standing beside the crib and observing. This was something she had learned through years of experience. Sometimes the most important thing was to truly see what was happening before trying to fix it. The nursery's temperature was perfectly controlled, but Sarah noticed that it felt sterile rather than comfortable. The lighting was bright and clinical rather than warm and soothing. Everything was positioned for optimal safety and hygiene, but nothing seemed designed for emotional comfort. Mrs. Whitman watched nervously as Sarah continued her quiet observation. "The doctors have tried everything," she said. "Feeding schedules, different formulas, medication for possible reflux, temperature adjustments. Nothing has made any difference." Sarah noticed something else that struck her as significant. Despite the baby's obvious distress, there were no signs that anyone had simply held him for extended periods. The crib was perfectly made, the expensive blankets arranged with precision, but there was no evidence of the kind of messy, loving care that distressed babies usually required. "Has anyone tried just holding him?" Sarah asked gently, not to fix anything or solve the problem, but just to be with him through whatever he's experiencing. Mrs. Whitman looked surprised by the question. "Well, certainly people have picked him up when trying to calm him, but he only cries harder when handled." The doctors advised minimizing stimulation since nothing seemed to help. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic, but recognizing that sometimes medical advice, while well-intentioned, could miss emotional needs that were just as important as physical ones. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward the baby. Mrs. Whitman hesitated. "Mrs. Thompson, I should warn you that he becomes quite agitated when people try to pick him up. Perhaps you should observe for a while first, get a sense of his patterns." But Sarah was already lifting James gently from his crib. The moment her hands touched him, she felt something that others had missed. The baby was rigid with tension, his tiny muscles held tight as if he was bracing against some unseen threat. Instead of trying to stop his crying or change his position, Sarah simply held him close to her chest and began to sway slightly. She didn't shush him or try to distract him. Instead, she began to hum softly, not a lullaby, but a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. The change wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. James's crying began to shift in quality, becoming less desperate and more like the normal crying of a distressed infant. His rigid muscles started to relax slightly against Sarah's warm body. Mrs. Whitman watched in amazement as the sound that had tormented the household for 3 weeks began to transform. It was still crying, but it had lost that heart-wrenching quality of desperation that had affected everyone who heard it. "How are you doing that?" Mrs. Whitman whispered, afraid to break whatever spell Sarah seemed to have cast. "I'm not doing anything," Sarah replied softly, continuing her gentle swaying and humming. "I'm just letting him know he's not alone." Marcus Wellington appeared in the nursery doorway just as James's crying softened to gentle whimpers. He stopped abruptly, unable to believe what he was witnessing. For the first time in 3 weeks, his son's cries had diminished to something that sounded like normal baby fussing rather than the desperate wails that had haunted the household. "Who is this?" Marcus asked Mrs. Whitman, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever magic was happening. "This is Mrs. Thompson from the agency," Mrs. Whitman explained quietly. "She just arrived 20 minutes ago." Marcus stared in disbelief at the woman holding his son. Sarah Thompson was nothing like the highly credentialed professionals he had hired. She was an older black woman with graying hair pulled back in a simple style, wearing plain clothes that spoke of practical work rather than professional status. But, somehow, she was accomplishing what teams of specialists had failed to achieve. Sarah looked up and met Marcus's eyes. She saw a man who was exhausted beyond measure, but also one whose love for his child was absolute. The expensive clothes and perfect surroundings couldn't hide the fact that he was simply a father desperate to help his suffering son. "Mr. Wellington," Sarah said gently, continuing her swaying motion with James. "Your son is a very special little boy. He's been trying to tell you something important." Marcus stepped into the room cautiously, afraid that his presence might trigger another crying episode. "The doctors said there's nothing wrong with him medically. They can't find any explanation for why he cries like that." Sarah nodded, understanding his confusion and frustration. "The doctors are right. There's nothing wrong with James physically. But babies don't just cry about their own needs. Sometimes they're responding to things happening around them that adults don't realize they can sense." James continued to settle in Sarah's arms, his crying becoming intermittent rather than constant. The change in the nursery's atmosphere was dramatic. The tension that had filled the room for weeks was beginning to dissolve. "I don't understand," Marcus said, moving closer to observe his son's transformation. What could he possibly be responding to? We've given him everything he could need. Sarah looked around the beautiful but sterile nursery, then back at Marcus. Mr. Wellington, can you tell me about James's birth? Was everything normal during the delivery? Marcus's expression darkened slightly. The birth was complicated. Catherine had to have an emergency cesarean section. There were some concerns about James's heartbeat during labor, but he was fine once he was born. The doctors said there were no lasting effects. And how was your wife after the delivery? Sarah asked gently. Catherine struggled with recovery. Marcus admitted reluctantly. She had some complications from the surgery, and then she developed what the doctors called postpartum depression. She's been having difficulty bonding with James. Sarah nodded, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form in her mind. Has your wife been able to spend much time with James since the crying started? Marcus's face showed pain as he answered. Actually, no. The crying upsets Catherine so much that she can barely be in the same room with him. Her doctors said the stress was making her condition worse, so we tried to minimize her exposure until she's feeling better. And you, Mr. Wellington? Sarah continued her gentle questioning. How do you feel when you hold your son? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, struggling with emotions he had tried to keep buried. I feel helpless, frustrated, like I'm failing him completely. Sometimes I wonder if he can sense that I don't know what I'm doing. Sarah's expression grew understanding and compassionate. Mr. Wellington, I think James has been crying because he can feel the sadness and fear in his parents. Babies are much more sensitive to emotions than most people realize. They can sense when the people who love them are in pain. The suggestion seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. Are you saying his crying is our fault? That we're causing his distress? Not causing it, Sarah clarified gently, but responding to it. James loves you and his mother deeply, even though he's only 3 weeks old. When babies feel that their parents are suffering, sometimes they try to express that pain in the only way they can. Marcus stared at his son, who was now resting quietly in Sarah's arms, occasionally making small sounds, but no longer crying desperately. That's impossible. He's just a baby. How could he possibly understand our emotional state? Sarah had encountered this disbelief many times in her career. I know it sounds strange, but I've seen it before. Babies who cry inconsolably when their parents are grieving or when there's hidden family stress. They're trying to communicate something that the family needs to address. She paused, looking directly at Marcus with eyes that held both wisdom and compassion. Mr. Wellington, I think James has been crying because he can feel that something is wrong with his mother, and he's been trying to bring attention to it. Marcus felt his legs weaken, and he sat heavily in the expensive rocking chair beside James's crib. The possibility that his son had been trying to help rather than simply suffering was overwhelming. Catherine has been so depressed, Marcus said quietly. She barely speaks, barely eats. The doctors say it's normal postpartum depression, but it seems so much worse than that. She keeps saying she's a terrible mother, that James would be better off without her. Sarah's expression grew grave. Mr. Wellington, has anyone evaluated your wife for postpartum psychosis rather than just depression? The symptoms can be similar initially, but psychosis is much more serious and requires immediate treatment. Marcus looked up sharply. Psychosis? The doctors said depression. Depression is much more common, so it's often the first diagnosis, Sarah explained. But when a mother can't bond with her baby, when she's having thoughts about the baby being better off without her, when she's completely withdrawn, those can be signs of something more serious. The room fell silent except for James's occasional quiet sounds. Marcus felt a chill as he realized that his wife's condition might be far more dangerous than anyone had recognized. Catherine's increasing isolation, her inability to care for herself, her strange statements about James, could all of this be symptoms of an undiagnosed serious condition? How could you possibly know this? Marcus asked, looking at Sarah with new respect and confusion. Sarah's face grew sad, and she held James a little closer. Because I went through something similar myself, many years ago. After my third child was born, I developed postpartum psychosis. I was fortunate that my mother recognized the signs and got me help quickly, but I remember the terrible feelings of disconnection and despair. She continued gently. My baby cried constantly during that time, just like James. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him either. It wasn't until I received proper treatment and started to heal that his crying stopped. Babies know when their mothers are in danger, even when the mothers themselves don't realize how serious their condition is. Marcus felt overwhelmed by this revelation. Are you saying that James has been crying because he's somehow trying to save his mother? In a way, yes, Sarah replied. Babies have an instinct to keep their parents close and alert when something is seriously wrong. His constant crying has kept everyone focused on the family's distress. He's been trying to make sure someone would eventually figure out what really needs attention. Mrs. Whitman, who had been listening in amazement, spoke up quietly. Mrs. Thompson, how can you be so certain about this? The medical professionals who examined both the baby and Mrs. Wellington. Sarah looked at both of them with the confidence of someone who had lived through similar circumstances. Sometimes the most important truths can't be found in medical tests or textbooks. Sometimes you have to listen with your heart as well as your mind. As if to confirm her words, James stirred slightly in her arms and made a small, contented sound, the first peaceful noise he had made since coming home from the hospital. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized the full implications of what Sarah was suggesting. His son wasn't sick or suffering from some mysterious condition. James was a healthy baby who had been trying desperately to communicate that his mother needed urgent help. What do we do now? Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion. If you're right about Catherine's condition, how do we help her? Sarah looked down at James, who was beginning to drift off to sleep in her arms, something that hadn't happened during his waking hours since the family came home. First, we get your wife properly evaluated by specialists in postpartum psychosis, not just depression. This condition is treatable, but it requires specific care. She looked back at Marcus with gentle determination. And, second, we make sure James knows that his message has been received, that he doesn't have to keep crying to protect his family anymore. Marcus stood up slowly, approaching Sarah and his son with a mixture of hope and fear. May I hold him? Sarah carefully transferred James to his father's arms. For the first time in 3 weeks, the baby remained calm when his father held him. Marcus felt his son's small body relax against his chest, and the emotional impact nearly overwhelmed him. He's not crying, Marcus whispered in amazement. He's actually peaceful. Because you finally understand what he's been trying to tell you, Sarah said softly. Babies are much wiser than we give them credit for. James knew his family was in danger, and he did everything he could to make sure someone would help. As Marcus held his quiet son, he felt a profound shift in his understanding of everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks. The parade of medical experts, the expensive treatments, the growing desperation, all of it had been focused on fixing symptoms rather than addressing the real cause. Mrs. Thompson, Marcus said, looking at her with deep gratitude and respect, how can I ever thank you for this? You've given me back my son and possibly saved my wife's life. Sarah smiled gently. Just make sure your family gets the help they need. And remember that sometimes the most profound solutions come from the simplest act of truly listening to what someone is trying to tell you. James made another soft, contented sound in his father's arms, and Marcus realized that his son had been the wisest person in the household all along. Through his desperate crying, James had been trying to save his family from a tragedy that none of the adults had seen coming. As she held the baby, Sarah's experienced hands detected things that medical instruments couldn't measure. James felt different from other babies she had cared for, not physically, but emotionally. There was a quality of isolation about him, as if he had been crying not just from physical discomfort, but from a deep sense of disconnection. The expensive nursery, for all its luxury, felt empty of the one thing babies needed most, the sense that they were truly seen and understood by the people caring for them. All the medical attention had focused on fixing what might be wrong, but no one had simply been present with James in his distress. I think, Sarah said thoughtfully as James's crying continued to soften, that this little one has been trying to tell everyone something very important, but nobody has been listening in the right way. Mrs. Whitman stared as the transformation continued. The crying was still there, but it had become the kind of crying that parents could work with rather than the desperate sound that had driven everyone away. What do you think he's trying to say? Mrs. Whitman asked. Sarah continued her gentle swaying. feeling James's tiny body gradually relaxing against her. Sometimes babies cry because something physical hurts. But sometimes they cry because something emotional hurts. And sometimes, she paused, looking down at the infant in her arms, they cry because they're trying to protect someone else. The statement seemed strange, but, as Sarah spoke, James's crying shifted again, becoming quieter and more like the normal fussing of a baby who was beginning to feel understood. Mrs. Whitman felt tears forming in her eyes as she witnessed something she had thought impossible. After 3 weeks of watching this family suffer, after seeing 7 qualified professionals fail to provide any relief, this woman with her gentle presence was creating the first real change they had seen. I think, Sarah continued, her voice filled with a certainty born of years of experience and intuition, that I know what's been troubling this little one. But it's not what anyone would expect. Marcus looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Well, sir, there are individuals who have raised many children, who have intuitive understanding that doesn't come from textbooks. Perhaps someone from a different background might see something that the specialists have missed. It was a radical suggestion for a household that typically employed only the most credentialed professionals. But, as the crying continued, and Marcus contemplated another sleepless night, he realized that his conventional approach was failing completely. The mansion felt different now than it had just a month ago. What had once been a showcase of success and achievement now felt like a prison of despair. The beautiful nursery that Catherine had spent months designing had become a place of mystery and frustration. The imported furniture, hand-painted murals, and carefully selected toys seemed to mock the family's inability to provide comfort to their own child. Marcus walked slowly up the stairs toward the nursery, each step feeling heavier than the last. Through the open door, he could see James in his crib, his tiny face red from crying, his small fists clenched in apparent frustration. The sight broke Marcus's heart anew each time he witnessed it. Standing beside the crib, Marcus felt the full impact of his helplessness. His son needed him, but despite all his wealth and power, he couldn't provide what James required. The crying seemed to pierce straight through him, carrying a desperation that no parent should have to witness without being able to respond. As he stood there in the elegant nursery, surrounded by the finest baby products money could buy, Marcus Wellington made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would be willing to try anything, to listen to anyone, regardless of their background or credentials. His conventional approach had failed, and he was ready to consider possibilities he had never imagined.